Hi, and welcome to Origin Sources and You, presented by Carnegie, powered by Underscore. This presentation was originally presented at Slate Stage 2022. My name is Jill Huntsberger. I am a Slate implementation strategist with Carnegie Slate Optimization Services powered by Underscore. I've been a Slate user since 2018, and before joining the Underscore team, I was a business systems analyst, aka Slate captain, at Columbia College Chicago. And for the purposes of today's session, the most important thing is that I am a total Origin Sources nerd, and I hope that by the end of today, you too will be a Origin Sources nerd along with me. So today's agenda, we're going to start with an overview of what are Origin Sources. We'll go through your initial setup. We'll talk about ongoing maintenance, and then we'll get into a bit about how to use the data. So first of all, what are Origin Sources? As you know, Slate already records every single change to a student record. Every form submission, every interaction, every data upload, every document import, every application submission. Slate is just recording these things automatically. Once you've implement and customize your origin sources, these allow you to organize these updates into categories and groups that are unique to your instance and how you want to analyze the data. Once your origin sources are configured, Slate will automatically calculate origin sources during overnight processing. And analysis of your origin source data can help you measure the effectiveness of things like your lead sources, determining which campus events have the highest ROI, gauging the impact of stealth applicants on your overall funnel, and more. But also, origin sources are very cool. You know, for many institutions, moving into Slate means that you have access to more data in different ways than you did in your previous systems. Generally, origin sources are configured at the end of phase 3 of your implementation. So you've spent all of this time with your head down, building things, creating things, transferring your data over, building new structures. And when you configure your origin sources, it's one of your first opportunities to take a step back and survey everything that you've done. You've built all this stuff. You've built these structures to hold vast quantities of data. Now you get a chance to think about how you want to analyze that data. What segmentation works for your institution? What questions do you want to answer about how your students first appear in your funnel? Where are you spending money on gut instinct alone? And maybe you'd like to get some more data to verify if those spends are worth it. Origin sources can help with all of that. So we're going to take some time to talk about initial setup. I'm focusing on setting up your origin sources for the first time, but everything that I'm saying here is going to be, you can also apply in an established instance that needs an origin source overhaul. So first of all, you need to find your origin sources in database. Within database, they are under the automations section, and you will see that there are two links there, origin groups and origin sources. So first, we're going to focus on an origin group. So click on that. And we are going to create an origin group called initial source. Now, there's no limit on how many origin groups you can create, but we really recommend starting with just one and calling it initial source. I do want to point out that within the knowledge base documentation, they recommend calling it first source, but we're going to use the words first and source a lot throughout this entire origin source process. So if you call it initial source, then you won't be saying first as often. It'll all kind of make sense in a moment, but know that initial source, first source, they both kind of mean the same thing. One really big important thing to remember about origin groups is that Slate is going to calculate the first and last source for every origin group. We're going to get to that. We're going to dig into a little bit more about what that means, but know that for every origin group, we get a first and a last source. So the reason we start with initial source is that regardless of what status a record enters your system, they're always going to have an initial source, that first way they entered into your instance. They could be a prospect on a name buy, an inquiry standing up for a campus tour, or a stealth applicant. They're always going to have an initial source. Now, while this is a goal that everyone's going to have an initial source, you will occasionally have some records that have a mystery source, but we'll talk a little bit later about some tools and configurations you can do to minimize your mystery sources. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to repeat many times, for every origin group, Slate is going to calculate the first source and the last source for that group. So what does that mean? A single record could have many data points. For example, this test student, first they came in August on your ACT score data file. Then their name came in September on the Naviance prospect list. Then in October, they signed up for a campus tour registration. Then in November, they submitted their Common App. Then in December, they signed up for an admissions counselor appointment. Now, any of those activities could be a first source for a student. There are students that are going to enter your instance for the very first time on a Common App load. There are going to be students that enter your instance for the very first time when they sign up for campus tour registrations. So any of these activities could potentially be an initial source. For this particular student, their first source is the one that chronologically comes the earliest, the one in August. So when we look at the student right now, their first source is in the initial source group is ACT score data file, and their last source in the initial source group is admissions counselor appointment. But then let's say they have another activity, such as sending in a transcript. Now this becomes the last source in that group. The first source doesn't change. That was the first one chronologically back in August, but now something new happened in January. So now they have a new last source in that origin source group. So anytime a new activity occurs, the origin sources are recalculated and a new last source is assigned. So we've got our first origin group. Now let's create an origin source. So go back to database, click on origin sources, and click on insert record. So you'll have a pop-up here with several configurations to set up your first origin source. You'll see you have a status, active versus inactive. For now, make everything active. You can use folders if you want, but very importantly, the next few ones you want to get. So summary acts as a label. You'll have to select an origin group. Right now, we only have one, so you'll just click that drop down and do your initial source. And then you will select a source type. So once you click on source type, you will see a drop-down which lists out all of the types of origin source activities or objects within Slate that can create origin sources. You'll see things like forms, source formats, tests, app creation. And then once you select one, you'll see a responsive list of sources that relate to that source type. So for our example here, our source type was form. And then when we select from the palette of forms available, we're going to do one for our request for information, our RFI form. Next, you'll do a category. Category allows you to define groupings that make sense for your institution. It's a text field, you'll fill that in. Then you have a couple other ones. You can do put a score in, you can do export values. Those are a little more advanced, maybe circle back to those after you do your initial configurations. But these data points here, summary, origin group, source type, source, and category are the required ones to move forward to the next step. So as you can see, you have to make quite a few decisions for each origin source. So we are actually going to back up a few steps before creating any origin sources. And we're going to define your categories. One of the biggest stumbling blocks for folks for setting up origin sources is understanding the difference between an origin group and the category of an origin source. Remember, Slate will calculate a first and last source for every group. So you want to keep your origin groups high level. We're starting with one origin group. Maybe you'll build out 3 or 4, maybe 5, but I've rarely seen more than 5 origin groups to keep it effective because that's a lot of data points in there. But within each origin source, you have a category. Think of categories like folders or buckets within your origin source set, or maybe as origin or as export groupings on a report. How do you want to kind of clump these different ones together? So you can see in my sample screenshot here, I have a whole bunch of origin source summaries, transfer tours, visits that all fall into the category of campus tour. That's that grouping, they come together. So to help you with this process, I want you to get out of Slate. Have a brainstorming session, pull up a spreadsheet or a Word document or a whiteboard, and think about all of the ways that student records come into your instance. You know, students are filling out inquiry forms or RFI forms. They're filling out paper cards at college fairs that then get transcribed into your system. They're signing up for open house. Their names are being imported on your ACT file. They're walking into your visitor center. They're sending you transcripts via parchment. They're sending you test scores in the Duolingo file. They're showing up on a school bus as part of a group tour, right? You get the idea here. Brainstorm all the ways that you get student names. Then take all of these and start to define them into categories that make sense for your institution with names that are clear and self-explanatory. You know, things like inquiry form goes into a category of inquiry form, pretty straightforward. College fairs, that's recruiting, and maybe you're grouping together college fairs, high school visits, transfer visits. You've got event registrations, test scores, materials, right? So you're getting a sense of how you want to group these together. And I want you to start with categories because this is where you get to think about how you'll group the data in a way that is meaningful for how your office and your leadership wants to report on and analyze origin source data. So for my example here, I usually recommend separating out event registrations into on-campus versus virtual. You know, from a student perspective, signing up for either type of event takes the same amount of time and investment. But from an institutional perspective, on-campus events require more resources. You've got more labor hours to run the event, bigger budget for things like catering and t-shirts, even like disruption to your entire campus for big events like open house. You know, on the flip side, as the pandemic winds down, your institution may be wondering if it is worthwhile to continuing offering this broad suite of virtual events. So if your origin source categories group all events into one category, then you lose out on an opportunity to partition that data. But if you separate them out, on campus versus virtual, you have segmented data. So once you have your category list, run it by the folks that will want to analyze the data to get their input before moving forward. So we've talked about customizing our categories, but you'll also want to customize your summaries to be useful labels. Or, you know, origin sources are great because they're completely customizable, but that means you have to customize everything. Every origin source needs to have a summary, and that functions as a label. So that's that first column on my screenshot here: transfer info sessions, transfer Saturday tour, et cetera, et cetera. You'll definitely want to focus on creating summaries that are intuitive and evergreen, and you'll want to decide what level of granularity you'll need for reporting. So what does this look like in practice? Sometimes it's really straightforward, one-to-one. You've got your form. The form name is prospective student request for information. So the category for that goes inquiry forms, and your summary is request for information form. It's an RFI form. The summary is RFI. Pretty straightforward. But then sometimes you'll want to make some more judgment calls. So let's say you have a series of off-campus interviews or appointments, and those are going to have marketing names. So perhaps for your freshmen, you're doing coffee chats, but when it's prospective transfer students, you call them transfer talks. And when they're done internationally in like the lobby of your hotel, we're calling those international study interviews. So from the student perspective, from the marketing perspective, they have these names, but ultimately what they all are is off-campus appointments. So if each of these has its own template and lives in its own subfolder, then you'll have to connect each one of these to its own origin source, but it may not make sense to use the marketing name as the summary. I would recommend instead giving them a summary that calls it exactly what it is in straightforward language. A coffee chat is an off-campus appointment for freshmen. A transfer talk is an off-campus appointment for transfer students, and international study interviews are off-campus appointments for international students. This way, if you down the road discover that the 18-year-olds in your region no longer like coffee, they're all about tea, and you change the name of coffee chats to tea times, your origin source summary still makes sense. It's still an off-campus appointment for freshmen. Or if somebody's looking at this report who's isn't part of your admissions office and maybe is higher up, they may not know that transfer talk is a one-on-one appointment. Maybe they're like, is that an appointment or is that a presentation or an event, right? So it kind of strips away that insider knowledge. So you can put these into 3 different summaries and give them 3 different summaries. But maybe this is too granular for your needs, and instead you decide to label them all as off-campus appointment. So my sample here, my first set, off-campus appointment, freshman transfer versus international, is their summary, and then their origin category, their category is off-campus appointment, or you can be a little more broad and just call them all off-campus appointments with a category of recruiting. So your summaries do not have to be unique. All 3 of these types of events, or appointments, even though they have different templates or different folders, you can give them the same summary if you want to group them together. So once you've created origin sources and they are assigned to students, they will appear on the dashboard. They'll be in the bottom right-hand corner. So you'll see for this student, they had an origin source of September 29th, 2020. You'll see the summary, and then you'll see the origin group there in parentheses. Now you've created one origin source. You'll need to do it a few dozen, a few score, maybe even a few hundred more times. So you'll definitely want to take a systematic approach to building out your origin source set, because we need to connect every single data point or action that could create an origin source to the origin source configurations. So what are those? Data points that connect to origin sources include forms, things that students fill out, person-scoped forms, person-scoped event templates, and person-scoped scheduler templates. It also includes things that students send to you, like materials and test scores. It includes things that you add to a student record, like interactions, and it includes things that you import, like source formats. Things that can create origin sources also include the structures that organize your instance. So in addition to templates for events and scheduler, you can also attach to folders. Similarly, for source formats, you can also use source folders. Things that do not create origin sources include application scoped forms, application scoped events and interviews, specific application sources, but don't worry, I have a way we can work around this one. Data points also do not include fields or populations, so you can't put an origin source based on a specific field value that a student has. You can't use application activities, inbox messages, or audit events. The other area that does not connect to origin sources are things that are in your instance that perhaps were not configured the best way. So for example, if you have a source file that does not have a source format, which is fine, we get lots of ad hoc source files, but is also not stored in a folder, you cannot connect it to an origin source. Similarly, if you have an event or interview that does not use a template, okay, we do that occasionally, but that's also not in a folder, you can't connect it to an origin source. So in addition to being an origin source nerd, I am also a nerd for folder and subfolder structure. I wanted to highlight these 2 in particular, source folders and event scheduler folders, because decisions you make early on in your setup and your folder structure can make things much easier or much more difficult as you configure origin sources and lots of other things. Folders impact so much more, like event landing pages, queries and reports. So many things are interconnected in your folder structure. So it's really important to devise a naming strategy that is easy to understand, that is evergreen, transparent, expandable. Okay, I could probably do an entire hour just on foldering, but know that anytime you invest in organizing your folders now will pay off in dividends down the road. So again, the systematic approach, work through your instance systematically. You have your first origin group and you defined your categories, and you want to go through and identify all the ways that student records are created, connecting each one to an origin source. Start with the modules that create the highest volume of student records, like source formats. Some of those source formats you're bringing in are bringing in hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of records. So you can get those origin sources for vast numbers of students by setting those up first. Remember to only include items that are options for new records in the initial source group. For example, registering for an admitted student day is not an initial source because they have to have an application before they can be admitted and invited to an admitted student day. And then you can leverage tools within Slate to help you build system queries to help audit potential sources. So for example, you could do a query, start with a configurable joins query with the category of related on the base of form. So then you're pulling in a query with one row for every form in your instance. Filter down by type. We just want event and scheduler. We don't want regular forms. And then as you put in a filter for folder in templates, you now have a query that shows you every template, or excuse me, every event and scheduler template that is in your instance. You can pull that out into a spreadsheet and start working through it. And when you do that, you'll also probably want to put a couple other exports on there: form type, form status, whether it's confirmed or tentative, and whether or not it's been archived. So drop that into a spreadsheet, add a couple more columns. One is category. You've already defined your categories. So now go through each of those templates and see which category does this go into. And then can this be an initial source? So in my sample here, accepted student day cannot be an initial source, but daily campus tour can be. So you'll want to build those ones out. Now you'll notice that I have daily campus tour old on my spreadsheet here, and the form status is tentative and that form has been archived. If that template was ever used, maybe you revamped your daily campus tours a couple years back, but you still have registrants from the past that use that template, then you still need to connect that to an origin source, because that student could have done that daily campus tour as a sophomore or maybe as a senior, and now they're inquiring again as a transfer student, right? So you could still have active records in your system whose origin source was related to an archived form. So don't skip your archived ones. You'll also notice, for example, that on this list, I have high school counselor breakfast. That is a template, but it was a counselor event. So there's never going to be students whose records initiated from an event like that. So you don't need to build out the origin source for that. This was a system query for forms specifically, but you can build similar queries for interaction codes, source formats, non-event forms to help do this process systematically and figure out your categories and figure out what are initial sources. You'll also want to make a query to help you find all the records in your instance that are missing origin sources. So do a person scoped query and put a filter on there that you'll join from person to origin source. You'll want to filter down to your origin source group of initial source, because that's the one we have right now, and do an existence query, non-exist, origin source, first, last, and that will find you all the records in your instance that do not have an origin source. When you first set that up, you'll probably have a lot of records in there, and you can chip away at that and figure out, like, what are the categories that you're missing? Oh, you may discover that they did some form that was archived years ago, and now you need to connect that form to your origin source group. So in addition to your initial source filter, you'll probably also want to put in a filter for created date. Remember, origin sources calculate the first time overnight. So if you have a big import today, those records won't get an origin source until tomorrow, or maybe even the day after. You can do created date of today -1, less than today -1, or less than today -2. If there is a lot of other things happening on overnight processing, say you have a particularly large data load or a particularly large export or a bunch of processing happening, maybe your origin sources don't calculate to the second day. So don't panic if you're not seeing on the first day after. But either way, don't worry if you're not seeing origin sources on records that were imported today. And of course, we're going to exclude our test records. So for my query here, I'm also pulling in a subquery export to figure out what was their first interaction and what was their first form. So that can help me identify what items still need to be connected to origin sources. So you'll work your way through, connect everything and get that number down as small as you can for number of records missing origin sources. The sample here was 71 students. This was a very large instance. They have a lot of records. So when you get down to double digits, maybe some of those are test records that were not tagged as tests, or a couple other mysteries that we'll clear up. But that's a pretty good result. So you've built out your initial source origin group. And now you may want to build out some additional origin groups to meet your needs. Remember that, I've said it a bunch of times, but remember that Slate calculates the first and last source for each origin group. So you want to keep your number of groups limited and be strategic. But some options that I have seen. So we've done initial source, right? Every student is going to have an initial source, but some students are going to enter as prospects, some are going to enter as inquiries. So maybe you want to split that out and have 3 more origin groups: prospect source, inquiry source, and application source. Now, if you're only doing the Slate app, or you're only importing Common Apps, your application source is going to be the same for all students. Application source is really only useful if you're an institution that brings in multiple application types. You could also do something like your campus visit source, right? So we know that stepping foot on campus can be a really important step in the recruitment process. And so maybe in addition to all these other things, you also want to see, when did the student first step foot on campus? Not register for an event, but actually show up. So when you're looking at your event and scheduler related origin source types, you'll see that you have registration, or you can connect to attendance. So for your campus visit source, you only want to record that source if a student actually showed up and attended. And I did also mention early on that when it comes to events and scheduler, only person scoped events can be connected to origin sources. So if you are looking at wanting to do campus visit source and include things like admitted student day or orientation or summer send-offs, things like that, you may have to also layer in an interaction. So if once the student attends those events, record an interaction, and then you can use that interaction to connect to that origin source for that origin group. So what does it look like in practice when you have multiple origin groups? On the student record here, my top student just has one origin source. It is their first source in initial source. But in the bottom record, this one student has a first source in 2 different groups. They have an initial source, first source, and a transfer source, first source. This particular instance has a lot of students who initially inquire as freshmen and then end up re-inquiring or applying as transfer students. So it made sense to them to have a transfer source origin group. So you'll see those kind of piling up in the bottom right corner, which on the dashboard, which is the other reason to keep your number of groups limited. So in practice, what does this mean? So an additional student, an individual student, in this example instance, they have initial source, prospect source, inquiry source, application source, and campus visit source. They have all 5. So for this student, their initial source was Naviance prospects, which means their prospect source was Naviance prospects. Then later on, they signed up for a campus tour. So that's when they were promoted from prospect to inquiry, and that became their inquiry source. Then they applied using the Slate application. So that's their application source. And then they attended that campus tour. So it wasn't enough that they registered for the campus tour, they actually attended, and that became their campus visit source. But there are some students that will skip some of these. So this student, Priya, she was never a prospect. Her first time entering the system was by filling out your inquiry form. So her initial source and her inquiry source are both inquiry form, but then no other action has taken place. She does not have an application source or a campus visit source. Next, we have Carlos. Carlos was a stealth applicant. He did the Common App. So he does not have a prospect source or inquiry source. His initial source and application source are both Common App. But then you'll also see some students will skip around. So Avery, they did the ACT and they sent their scores. So their initial score source and prospect source are both ACT scores. And then they hung out, didn't really take any other action, never became an inquiry until one day they got an email inviting them to do your Fast App, your application creation form. So they were promoted directly from prospect to application. So their application source was Fast App. And then after applying, they attended the open house and that became their campus visit source. So you'll see that you're layering in this data, you're creating additional opportunities for segmentation, and you're painting that picture of all those steps, those key points in that process. So you'll definitely want to set yourself up for success. There's a few small configurations that I want to talk about. Earlier on in this presentation, I mentioned that origin sources are one of the last things you build out during your implementation. But I also mentioned that there could potentially be a few mystery sources, those records that seem to appear in your system out of nowhere. If you think back to my sample query that showed records that don't have origin source, and I had 71 records in that instance that don't have origin sources. These are those mystery sources. So there are a few things you can do in the initial build that will help minimize those mystery sources. So I want to focus on 3 suggested configurations: an internal record creation form, an account created, no app started interaction, and application creation interactions. So the first is the internal record creation form. So if you go to the lookup tool and you look up a student and you don't find them in your instance, you have this lovely new person button to add a record. And when you click on that, you get this pop-up that looks like a form, feels like a form, but is not actually a form. What you're doing when you click on that new person button, you're entering the bare minimum data points, right? The 4 matching criteria that Slate uses to merge records: email, first, last, and birth date, and creating a student record. But even though that looks like a form, it's not actually a form. So if you do that person creation pop-up, but then no other action happens on that student record, like you're not immediately going in and adding a transcript or immediately going in and recording an interaction for why you've created that new person, then this student will not have an origin source until they take some other action, which maybe won't be until weeks or months later. So what we recommend doing is creating an internal record creation form. This can be a copy of your inquiry form. So if you're at the beginning of your build, wait until you've got your inquiry form nailed down and then make a copy of it. And you can make some of those fields optional, things that if it's the public facing inquiry form, you probably want to require them to put in their major of interest and their expected high school graduation year or things like that. But if the student is just like walking into your visitor center, you may not get their date of birth or something like that. So you can make some of those fields optional because you may not actually have every data point. You can also add an interaction widget or fields to capture interactions so that if that is, say, for example, a walk-in, you can record the information about that conversation and have it go right onto the student record at that time. So once you've created that person creation form, you can connect that to that new person button. There is a handy knowledge base article with instructions on how to do that. Search for customizing the new record lookup link, and then you can connect that form to that person creation button. And now, whenever somebody goes to the lookup tool and clicks on new person, they're actually submitting a form. And then, of course, connect your person creation form to your origin sources, and all of those students will have an origin source. The next one I want to talk about is the scenario where an account has been created by the student, but they've not started an application. So if you're using a Slate application, you will most likely somewhere on your website have an Apply Now button. And when a student clicks on that button, they'll go to the application management page. And if they're first-time users, they can create an account. Most students, they'll click that create an account, and then they will start their application shortly thereafter, no problem. But sometimes if this is a brand new student to your instance, they might not start their app right away, right? They click that button while they're at school, and then they never get around to doing that email for a couple weeks. So if that's the case, what happens is you see a student record with no origin source in that bottom right corner and a timeline that looks really bare. You'll see a person created date. They'll probably hit your person status rules and get a person status of prospect. Maybe they'll get, a staff assign rule, but then not much else happens after that, except maybe you'll see a few record access lines as somebody's clicking in there to figure out where the heck this student came from. So there's not a lot of data on there. What we recommend doing is creating an interaction code for these students. So it's normal to have a little delay. Maybe they click the button at school and on Wednesday and they wait till the weekend to do their application. So we don't want to record this interaction immediately. But if, say, I don't know, a week has passed and they've not actually started their application, let's go ahead and get this interaction on their record so that you know where these students came from, how they appeared in your instance. So create an interaction code. In this example, we've given it a label of Slate app account created. And we just did a single one. We didn't do like a parent code and a subcode because it was a one-off. And then we created a rule. Basically, if their status is still in inquiry and prospect, right? They have not started an application, so their status is still inquiry prospect. And they have that pin created reset timestamp of today -7, less than today -7, right? So they did that step over a week ago. Then we're going to go ahead and put that interaction on the student record. Then, of course, connect that interaction to your origin sources, and those students will have an origin source once a week has passed. So this is one exception where they're not going to get an origin source for about a week, but you want to give them a chance in case they're doing any other action, like actually starting the application, to be their origin source. All right, my final category is application creation. Now, if you only have one type of application, you are only using a Slate app or you're only importing common apps, then go ahead and use the Slate standard source type of application creation. Once they create an app, if that's their first step, that becomes their first source. No problem. But if you have multiple types of applications in Slate, like you have a full app and an app creation form, or if you're also importing apps, then this origin source does not allow you to specify what type of application it is. You can't segment whether it's an imported app versus a Slate app. So all apps are created, even if they're imported or coming from app creation forms, they're all listed as Slate application in terms of their origin source, if they're a stealth app. So instead of using this app creation source, we're going to create some interaction codes. So in this instance, they have 3 types of applications. So we created a parent interaction code of application creation and subcodes of common app, nursing CAS, and occupational therapy CAS. So we have 3 interaction codes. Then, if it's an imported application, you'll want to do a static mapping to write that interaction code when that application is imported. So just set those up right on your static mappings. And for your Slate applications, you'll want to set that interaction code with a rule. So looking here in this instance, your filters are application is submitted today, and this school only had common app as the other one, so common app wasn't submitted that day. So we're setting the interaction code of Slate app. Then you connect those different interaction codes to your origin sources, and you can segment your data. Very important, do not also do this application creation. You want to not do an application, a source type of application creation. You're only going to do the interaction code type of origin sources. And for this one, you'll want to set up these origin sources, you want to set up these interaction codes, the rules and the imports as soon as you start doing application imports. If you're just now realizing it at the end of your implementation that you didn't do that, you already have a bunch of apps in, you can go back and untangle the data, get those interaction codes on there. But this is one that's much, much easier if you can get it all set up before you start importing or accepting any applications. Great, so we set everything up and we never have to think about it again, right? Wrong. There is always going to be ongoing maintenance. Your Slate instance is always growing and changing. You're going to create new event templates and folders, new scheduler templates and folders, new source formats, new forms. You're going to reorganize your folders. Anytime any of these things happen, whether you're creating something new or moving something around, you're going to have to reconnect these items to your origin sources. So I recommend setting up an audit query so that you can keep track of records that do not have origin sources. So this is exactly the same as the query we built to first set up our origin sources. Just be sure you definitely have that created date of today, less than today -1, or maybe less than today -2, to keep an eye on it. Designate somebody as your origin source keeper. Find your origin source nerd at your institution, and maybe give them a little crown or something so that they're really into it, and dub them origin source keeper. Have that be the person who is monitoring this query, but is also that voice in the room that, like, when your events team is talking about adding another event and they're building on another template, they say, oh, you've got a new template, let's get that as an origin source. That person who as you're doing your cycle prep and you're thinking about adding a second inquiry form, remembers to connect that new inquiry form to your origin sources. And you want to stay on top of this query, because maybe if you catch it when it still has 71 students missing origin sources or 90, that's manageable. You can clean it up. But maybe you ignore it for a couple weeks, it creeps up. You ignore it for a few months, suddenly you have a 5-digit number, and you have a lot of untangling to do to get those all reconnected. So stay on top of it. Back when I had this role in my previous institution, I checked this query once a week. My colleagues now say that's too much. You can do it once a month. Find the amount that works for you and stay on top of maintaining them. So you have all this data. How are you going to use it? Origin. We looked at the student record and we saw how in the bottom right corner, you can see the origin sources for individual students. And that's great. You can see a snapshot, a picture of where that student came from and see their story. But where origin sources really shine is when you use that data in the aggregate. So layering origin sources into reports. Take those funnel reports that you already have and layer in origin sources. You can have your exports be each individual origin source. You can have your exports be the origin source category, right? That's where we're leveraging those categories as export groupings on your report. You can do parts by each origin group, and you can look at individual sources to see, what is their effectiveness? How are different things impacting your inquiry to application rate? How are things impacting your melt rate? See how conversion rates, look at your conversion rates for different types of name buys. You can see how things like your campus visit impact your funnel. You can compare behavior between students who initially register for on-campus events versus initially registering for virtual events. On your reports, you can layer in dollar amounts to see for different marketing efforts to evaluate their ROI. You can also layer in origin sources not only on funnel reports, but on year-to-date reports. So if there's a name buy that you've been doing every year, then see if those sources are maintaining their effectiveness to see if it's worth spending that money next year. You can compare students who registered for an event at any point in the cycle to those students that have an event as their initial source. Lots of ways to play around with this, get them all configured, set your reporting team onto it, and see what kind of magic they can create for you. So we're at the end here. I just want to give you a few more top tips, kind of some quick hits to round things out. The first is that origin sources are not calculated in test. So dive right in, make your changes in production. And the good news is if you make a mistake, you'll just fix them and the records will update by tomorrow. So if you reconfigure your origin sources, like say you have a typo in one of your summaries or categories, make the change and they'll recalculate overnight. So dive right in. do the changes in production. Okay, origin sources are calculated every night for any record that was updated that day. So you have a record that already exists, they take an action like signing up for a campus tour, then there was a change on that record is going to update overnight and recalculate the origin sources, first sources and last sources for every group. Now, if you reconfigure your origin source setup, you're connecting some new forms, changing some labels, rearranging some categories, those origin sources will recalculate overnight for any record that has been updated within the past year. So if you're making kind of a big overhaul of your instance, you may have records that have not been touched for several years. You have to kind of push those to run through because they're not going to run through automatically. And it's not enough just to do a retroactive refresh. Because if you do a retroactive refresh on those records and they fall through your rule set, and because they're old records, they don't land on any rules, nothing changes, that's not enough to make them recalculate their origin sources. So if you have some older records and their origin sources aren't refreshing, one trick that I found really helpful is I'm going to create a field in my instance. It's a person scoped field called admin update or administrative update. So then if I want to push some old records to go through the origin source calculation, I'll do batch management and I will update my admin update to today's date. Then a data point has changed on that record. That data point isn't impacting anything else. We're using it just for this purpose, but that is enough then to actually trigger those records to go through the origin source calculation. And then my final top tip is about the difference in how Slate looks at source formats versus source folder when calculating origin sources. And this one definitely took me a little while to wrap my brain around. And I saved it for the end after your brains are a little full, but we're going to dive in. So Slate prioritizes source formats over source folders when assigning an origin source. So in my first row here, my first sample, the ACT import, this one has both a source format and a source folder, right? The ACT file has the source format of ACT score data file. It lives in the source folder of ACT import. When I'm configuring my origin sources, I want to connect the source format because format is more important than folder when origin sources are calculated. So for the ACT import, I'm going to have an origin source type of source format. Now, maybe you have some ad hoc files that don't have source formats, totally normal. This one, college fair list, there's no source format, but the source folder is college fair attendees. For that one, the origin source type is source folder. But if you have something, everyone's got that folder of randoms, your prospect name buys folder or something similar. So maybe that folder has a mix. There are some name buys that don't have source formats and some that do. I'm going to need to connect both, right? Name by ABC doesn't have a source format, so I'm going to connect that folder, prospect name buys. And I think, great, I'm done. I've connected that folder. Everything in the folder will get a source format. Not true. If the folder is connected, but then something in that folder has a source format, like name by XYZ, I have to connect that source format because it's in a folder, but the format takes priority. So in addition to connecting my folder of prospect name buys, I also need to connect name by XYZ source format. Now, I know that one was a lot. Just know that there is some really good documentation and knowledge base about this source format and source folder configurations for origin sources. So if anything, the takeaway for that one is when you're building those out, remember, oh, Jill said there's something about source formats and source folders. Let me look in knowledge base to make sure I've got that one configured correctly before going forward. So here we are. Big picture, origin sources are going to help you answer the question, where did this student come from? That's in the small scale in the one-on-one relationship. But by artfully and strategically configuring your origin groups and sources, your summaries, your types, and your categories, it's going to help you answer the bigger question, is it worth it to find more students from that same source? Thank you so much for your time. And we appreciate it. And hopefully you too are now an origin source nerd right along with us.